Shall I start again? And
Yeah, I'm gonna redo the episode. It's like,
okay, great.
hello, everybody. So we had some technical difficulties just there. For the first time, we actually had to stop the broadcast and start it over again. It looks like it's going okay right now. Worst case scenario, I'm gonna turn off video. But it's a pleasure, as always, to be here with you. And this is the start of the 14th episode of Like Clockwork. I won't really speak very long before getting into this one. We have a lot that we're going to discuss. These are some amazing artists, and I want you to think about the avant-garde, the abstract, the absurd. These artists also have interdisciplinary practices, curatorial practices, and I've just for now labeled them as filmmakers, which is particularly reductive. But it is a pleasure to introduce or reintroduce this group of folks to you all. First, I'll go to Michael. Michael, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello there. I'm Michael Mercereau, he, him. Excited to be a part of this as well. Uh, and I am a filmmaker, visual artist, musician. I work a lot with sound and installation. And a lot of my past just comes from like the very cinephile experience of like living near a movie rental store and a kind of obsession with horror film and just kind of picking things out of the shelf that look strange that I could see for the night and then or return in the next day. Uh, but yeah, I've been working with all these different like materials and content that kind of specifically addresses uh, the language of cinema, also, and more or less horror film and melodrama being the two focal points for my work. There's more than that, but if I were to sum up many things, that would be my best way. Thank you.
Oh, it's a privilege to have you on. And Tracy?
I'm Tracy Miller Robbins, and my practice involves it always stems from drawing, and it stems from drawing, and sometimes it stays there, but then all of the different things that I do, from projected installations to short films, also start with different types of drawing. I think um, drawing and painting are something that doesn't seem as much like a starting point for a lot of the work that I see. So anyhow, I create large scale installations. Most recently, I've been experimenting with AI and have been using my drawings to train AI to create new drawings. I'm fascinated with the idea that a machine could create my work. Um, but I'll get more into all of that in a bit. Thanks.
Okay, so now we could see how things will percolate. And Peter?
Hi, my name is Peter Lichter, and I am from Budapest, Hungary. So here it is 12 past midnight, and if I be a little bit slow, it's that because it's in that time I usually sleep, and if I be slow, it is because of my shitty English. So sorry in advance I have if I have some challenge with the language. I am a filmmaker and a writer, so I make experimental feature films and short films since 2002, and that's what which is visible to the international experimental film community. That's why I'm here. And which is invisible internationally is that I write books on the history of cinema in Hungarian, and I've written a book on Steven Soderbergh. I've written a book on Steven Spielberg, or I've just finished and I published a book on the history of American cinema. So I am a little bit the fan of Hollywood and underground cinema and everything which is from North America. And I am a teacher at the university, which pays my rent, and that's about me.
This is an amazing, impressive group of folks who I have known in some way through their work or online or somewhat in person for a bit. So I look forward to the way that this conversation will develop. And Michael, I'm going to hand this off to you. Please feel free to tell us about anything that is driving your practice.
Yeah, so I was going through a bit different stuff, taking notes, and I found this really helpful also just for myself and getting a good sense of my own language of cinema and who I'm talking to and who I'm not talking to. So I came up with like a few different prompts, more or less, and also a couple that just came up to me just now listening to everybody's introduction. So I have been like thinking about how film and cinema, both narrative and in our case experimental, will take the genre of horror and reflect back social and individual experiences. In other words, I've been really interested in archetypes, symbolisms, allegories, and the relationship between narrative horror and also experimental horror because I've been in a few circumstances where I've talked with a couple of people who analyze film, and I said like, oh, so you have these really great things about suspense and horror within your writing and how you analyze. And I'm so curious about what the experimental, and I mean, I know a lot of this is just where I'm looking, but I've noticed that there is a lot of kind of like very little uh, discussion or knowledge back, and I'm sure that I will learn right now that there's tons of it. Uh, and another thing that came to me too is also just like background and how we interpret our work. So I was raised with a very with Mexican Catholicism style, Latine from my mother's side from Mexico, and I've been really curious about how those symbols kind of uh, take our work over and also unconsciously go into our own inspirations that we have. And also, like, how when we do express those things, how do we invite others into it who don't have that background or maybe not familiar with those symbols and those stories. So that's been another really big interest in me is like how do I invite people and not be uh, exclusive and be more inclusive of my practice. And then another third thing, and I don't feel like we need to talk about all these separate things together, is someone had brought up uh, actually Tracy had brought up AI, and I've also been working with a lot of AI in my own work and seeing it as a tool. And I know there's a lot of discussion about AI, so I hope not to beat a dead horse about it, but I also have found that as kind of almost like a painting tool in adding aspects of the camera that one can't afford, or also reflecting back one's own work. And it has definitely a collective knowing that is able for us to tap to, and very easy for everybody to work with. And I found like working with these my very specific my very specific stories and symbolism that inspire me have been really great for just kind of getting uh, another uh, another kind of like option or like a separate view than what I normally don't see. And then coming and taking that and bringing it back into the work. And sometimes I can use it, sometimes I don't. But I really think that that has also a lot of interesting potential. And now, also another thing too is I wanted to uh, bring up about Kenneth Anger, who died recently, and I kind of feel uh, fits into a lot of the different things that we all do. Uh, so I know that's a list, but perhaps there will be some interest, or perhaps something will cross over between what others are mentioning.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to pass this over to Tracy, and yeah, no, I'm absolutely sure that there's going to be a lot for folks to talk about there. I've been thinking about AI actually a lot recently, um, both the ups and downs. But I find it funny that while I definitely see the downsides of it, and will illustrate those a little bit more. I think that the same folks who are like advocating for cinema, right, are against it, as if cinema is some sort of virtuous thing. So anyway, pass it on to you, Tracy.
Hi. I've often joked after every work that I create, I kind of feel like naming it. Yeah, I don't know either. Um, just because I feel like my process, like I remember when I was painting, I read, it might have been Kandinsky, I'm not sure who, had said something about the process where you like go into the work, you go into the painting, and later you kind of step out of the painting. And I feel like that's still my process. And some of what Michael was talking about as far as the symbols, I feel like as I'm working, things emerge, and it's kind of hard to talk about those. Like when you're talking about your work, it's like, well, all these things just kind of happened. But they echoed back on the things that I had been thinking about. Meaning, I think some of the thoughts on AI have to do with this notion that people are just kind of having a machine make the work. And certainly we see that happen, but then the work all looks the same. So it's kind of like, why are you getting all upset? Because the work is kind of like when everyone got all upset about the Flash software and said all animation with Flash looks exactly the same. Well, if someone with animation skills was using it, you might not even know it was Flash, so you weren't saying that about that particular work. And anyway, I won't go on that tangent about Flash, but I think with AI, there's this notion that all the work is going to look the same. And there's this notion, someone called it the plagiarism machine the other day. And, certainly when I'm doing like 60 portraits of women and then I'm inputting those and I'm hand drawing each one, and they have like some essence in the end of what my work is. Or if they don't, I might go back and I might do 60 more kind of obsessively, because I was trained like an animator, so doing like hundreds of drawings is something I kind of like doing. But anyway, when I first started doing that, I just find a starting point. I just draw something, and then I kind of see what happens. And I've always been fascinated with the idea of portraits. I've always been fascinated with the idea of like sheets of portraits, and how we kind of look back on those times in our lives, and maybe, there's this whole sheet in a yearbook or something, or if you wanted to, maybe in the old days, date or purchase a bride, or I don't remember what, but I feel like I saw all these sheets, or even like worse things where you see like just sheets of portraits. But when I started the series, I was thinking a lot about, I know someone who has the facial recognition, what's that called? I can't remember what that's called, but they can't recognize faces. And so I went online and I was doing the test. Like my son did it and he got a pretty, like a score where he's like, I kind of have it. I did a score and I did not have it. And then I started thinking about how all the images were male faces, and I thought that was very, very odd. It's like all the tests I could find were like male frat boy faces, and it was like, well, I'm not sure how much we're learning from that, but okay. But then I started thinking about how I have had experiences where I've seen someone in a crowd and I thought, I know I've seen them sometime in my life. And there are even times when I can remember, like I was at a bus station and I could see this person and I saw this person just once. And there was just something about them that struck me. And then years later, I see them and I think, that's that person. And I have no idea who they are. Well, there are people who are super recognizers. So that caused me with the portraits to start thinking, am I a super recognizer? I'm not. But there are people who have like this photographic memory of events. And anyway, I created these portraits and I started having AI train, and AI was creating new portraits, and some of them were kind of fragmenting, and it started echoing back to like shrouds, because some of them were more clear than others. And I started thinking about how much time I spent as a child thinking about shrouds. And I don't know, like, are those intentional, those things that kind of bubble up in your work and you recognize? I'm really good at going off on tangents, by the way. At least I think I am. But someone asked me recently, I was doing a live stream for Digital Graffiti Festival this past weekend, and the interesting question that kind of stuck with me that I keep thinking about is, how do you know when it's finished? And I feel like I'm trying to get something very different in my work. A lot of times that's not exactly a film, but I'm really interested in people wanting to spend time with the work the same way you would a painting, like a Bonnard painting, where you might start to notice more about the details the more time you spend, the marks, new things might reveal themselves. And so I'm creating these loops that I want people to like engage with in a different way. And when I showed my work at Chicago Filmmakers, I was the only one without like credits on my film. But I don't put credits on the film because I think of them as like a drawing or painting. It's like, where would I put that? Because I'm thinking it's going to loop and it's going to be this experience that someone's going to engage with the image. And I almost don't see it ending. But anyway, how do I know if it's done? I think it's like gut instinct a lot of times, but there's just something that I almost start out kind of knowing how I want things to be paced or how they might want to reveal themselves. I think how to start it or why to start something is more of an issue for me. I just kind of jump in and see what happens. I'm not timing myself, so I can stop there.
I'm just saying you can keep going if you want. This is
I think that's a good stopping
okay.
point.
You're good. You're good. Well, there's a lot to respond to as well. I've been over here typing notes. And now we're going to move over to Peter. Hi, Peter. Also, again, this is extra recognition. It is past midnight, and Peter is here with us. So for me, I'm very, very honored to have your presence, and also because immediately after I had reached out to you, I remember you're like, yeah, let's go. So I look forward to your presentation.
I didn't prepare any presentation, so I will improvise as the others, I suppose. I can connect to Michael as an avid fan of the horror genre and the fan of uh, narrative filmmaking, in a sense of, as you know, as a cinephile, because if I have to talk about my background, I would talk about that I started to make basically experimental films uh, in a way that I didn't see any experimental films that time, and I just basically called them experimental films because I felt they were strange. And I was 18, and it was the early 2000s, and the early 2000s in Hungary there was no how to say it, culture of experimental cinema or institutions of experimental cinema, because basically and still isn't, because basically there is a very few filmmakers who are in the experimental film discourse or practice. But it wasn't in that way forever, because during the communist regime, so basically before 1989, there was, for example, a studio uh, for only experimental films, and it was called BBS, Balázs Béla Studio, named after Balázs Béla, or Béla Balázs, who was a very important film theorist, and I think you know him because in he was translated into English and into German. So he was in the early 20s, and he was very important in the early film theory. And in that time, so basically from the 60s to the late 80s, there was a very strong experimental film culture at Hungary, basically, which was led by Gábor Bódi, who was a very important figure in the 70s and the early 80s. Unfortunately, he died very early when he was 39, but he became a very important figure at in Central Europe or Eastern Europe in the in experimental cinema scene. Basically, he started the first video journal, Infermental, which was basically the idea of the YouTube in the 80s. So he was a genius, but he died very early, and with his death after the fall of communism, somehow this film culture slowly disappeared, and for example, with this disappearing, the discourse also disappeared, and I learned film history at the university, but uh, and it's a interesting fact that, for example, the first time I was meeting with the name of Stan Brakhage, who is a major figure in the experimental film history. At the first time, it was the last year, because that was the year when the David Bordwell's film history was translated into Hungarian. So that's why basically I met the name of Stan Brakhage, and I saw my first Brakhage on YouTube in 2006 or 2007. So you can imagine it was a very, very, very shitty quality of some, VHS grabbed a shit copy. But it was my first meeting with the experimental cinema, and that time I was making films, and I was making experimental films, which were connected much more to this kind of surrealist tradition and to the uh, French impressionist tradition, which what I know. And later I started to experiment with fan footage in the late 2000s, and it was very practical because I had to use fan footage, namely Super 8 millimeter films, because I didn't have any money for cameras and I didn't like the video camera quality, and so that's why I started to paint on, with nail polish on the Super 8 celluloid, and I started to project it on my kitchen's wall and video back, and I started to edit it. So basically that was the time when I started to make fan footage films, and more or less it is still I'm going to with this subgenre of experimental cinema, but I still very interested in the narrative, with the possibility of adaptation. For example, last year I adapted, or we adapted, because I have a friend who written the screenplay. So we adapted the first Agatha Christie novel into a fan footage collage film, which was screened in Rotterdam this year, and it has a I think it has the purest version of my brain, that I'm very conservative in a way and I'm very experimental, so I love the two end of the spectrum of film culture. I love Ken Jacobs and I love Spielberg, and I don't like in between. So I want to mix together everything which is in the two end of the spectrum. So that's why basically we made 2 years ago a fan footage horror film, The Philosophy of Horror, which was basically a adaptation of the Noel Carroll book, with the celluloid strips of the Nightmare of Elm Street, and with painting and direct cinema technique. So that's what I am very into in the past 5 or 10 years. And that's the point when I finish my monologue.
Amazing. I I think in many ways this episode kind of knowing where everybody's practice is, or where everybody's practice is situated, it gave me an opportunity to kind of pre-think some of my remarks, as opposed to normal, where sometimes it's like I don't even know where I'm going to go with it. But there are so many different ties between each one of your practices, and also just an experience, which often folks have. And I'll start with that, which is this trying to figure out what experimental film is, especially at a time where you're beginning to develop your ideas in teenage years, especially. It's funny because we are at Chicago Filmmakers. We have a teen summer youth filmmaking camp. Put on my marketing, but like seriously, in the sense that when I was a teenager, that was the thing that literally saved my life, was learning how to make movies, because I was otherwise going off on a very, very dark path of not um, taking care of myself and doing things that making very, very poor decisions with my body. And so what I think that and part of the reason why my own movies are disassociative productions was to essentially rid myself of one form of disassociatives for hopefully one that would eventually get me out of the sort of place that I was, where I was. And so filmmaking practice, but also finding work, like certain work, um, had a massive impact. And I don't think that it can be underestimated, the shift in consciousness that is possible with experimental horror. And so my topic subject for this, with a little bit of a long-winded context, is a defense of the abject and experimental horror. And so I think that there is something to the horror genre, obviously, since the beginning of filmmaking, in the sense of its arresting of an audience. It's interesting to think too of how the horror is so blatantly mixed with early surrealism. And I don't mean like just Un Chien Andalou, but I'm talking about like the Seashell, the Clergyman, even Metropolis, the sense of the labyrinthine and the architecture that one could construct within the unconscious of the viewer within cinema was something that was already being discovered at that point, to a degree that filmmakers nowadays can't even emulate. There was also the direct feeling of the body, but the body abstracted and placed inside of an exterior reality. The problem with cinema, as I've always discussed, is kind of like on this podcast, is like the exteriority of our practice. We oftentimes have to shoot things from the outside. And so we use actors, for instance, as vehicles for metaphysical place and emotions, and performance is a means by which that is also evoked. I always also think about how weird it would be, though, if like we were thinking about if animals were watching cinema, how they wouldn't have necessarily um, that same relationship to that which is being depicted within the illusion of the narrative that's being depicted. But there's something within at least the human reality that is bound by the performative, the body, the way in which people transfer information from one another, the social, as depicted through character, and then a scenario of the character. The scenario that's built out over a narrative serves as a sort of existential platter upon which my own practice has always been interested in, the folks who are capable of establishing the sort of narrative diegetic space of such strong presence, which is a term that's also used in virtual reality. Virtual reality uses presence to mean the point at which the sensory experience becomes joined with the illusion, so that there is at the very least, momentary or unconscious reaction to the visual or to the stimuli that's presented within a virtual reality environment, and the host subject, if we're going to use parasitic terms to describe it. I'm interested in the way that this horror plays out, because it and immediately enraptures folks. And Laurie Felker actually made a point a couple of weeks ago on this podcast about a horror that inspires laughter. And yes, I do think that that's part of it. There's a laughter that comes to certain elements of horror, but there's a different type of horror movie, and it's not one that's built in the horrific. I'm not saying Cronenberg is bad, but and I'm not saying it's built in gore or built in the body, but rather that there's a type of horror that puts one into a conspiratorial downturn, that causes one to really begin to fixate upon the nature of reality, and then upon exiting the theater, for instance, or exiting the space, there is the after. The after is what or what I have always constructed or attempted to construct with my own practice, figuring out how I can get to that moment of re-ingest that occurs. The last thing I'll talk about is the symbolic order, because that was one thing that Michael brought up, and I think it brings us all the way down. When you were talking, Peter, I was writing this. I also started to make experimental films in the way when I was 18 in the early 2000s in the US, where there was a culture of experimental film, but it was stuck in dogma. It didn't recognize things very often from a narrative or a horror state. And I love Ken Jacobs as well, but I've heard Ken Jacobs give a lecture where he's like, narrative film is nothing. It's like it's the worst. It's like trashing it to, but understanding that that's his philosophy in the way that he's viewing film as a phenomenological project. I said that instead, at the time in the United States, we were approaching the negation of hipsterdom, and that was just an attempt, a hedonistic comfort, that it was a self-applied anesthetic that followed the inaction, political inaction of the early 2000s and the post 9/11 patriotic George W. Bush years. And then the experimental film scene um, was often quick to rid itself of early surrealist and avant garde traditions. And I would also say, quick to rid itself of hip hop. And that in itself created, for a period of time, a particularly type of brutal, cold cinema, and one that I felt was inauthentic. There's something very authentic about horror cinema, even when it's playing cheesy. But the horror cinema that I really began to write down, speaking of Kenneth Anger, right? I always think Kenneth Anger's stuff is horror. It's like Invocation of My Demon Brother is horror. I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's really pissed off at Kenneth Anger, doesn't like Kenneth Anger. And I can understand the debates both ways. And I think Kenneth Anger as a figure, or as a person, was one who was given to a project that one cannot deny was based around something pretty evil. So there's definitely that within the work. I think that's part of what motivates some horror filmmakers, or those who attempt to use horror as the genre. But I feel like, in fact, there's some folks, I hope myself included, who think of horror as a means by which a warning can be brought out, that actually you can develop consciousness with a medium as radically significant, as radically perceptual as horror. And that in fact, I believe horror to still be, or fear, the installation of that um, impulse to be one of the key methods by which evil people will use virtual reality to fully take clasp of human mind. Because there's something to the way a movie and the way virtual reality begin to simulate psychedelics and things of that nature, with the amount of fear added, allowing for there to be a conspiratorial fall or purge into nothingness. Now, I bring it there because that's the heart of my conspiratory thinking, and it was formed by movies like Eraserhead and Holy Mountain, and all of the work of Cronenberg, early Cronenberg, Generation P, which maybe you don't count as a horror movie, down to I think of the House and the No Wave films too, in their form of camp horror. But despite anything political, or despite anything that he may have said, War is Menstrual Envy by Nick Zed is particularly intense. So I do um, very much respect this form of filmmaking. And if I could sum up everything that I do, it is just a Trojan horse, so that I could one day be given a couple $1 million to make a horror film. Anyway, that's it. So back to you all. Hello. I don't know if anybody can actually see everybody. Yes, everybody is visible on
Yeah,
screen. Very good.
yeah.
Um,
Can
I
I
I just
go for it?
I'm just fascinated by this idea of starting to make films as a teenager, which isn't something I did. And I mean, did everyone else do that? Because I didn't even know. Well, I didn't think I had the capacity. When I was 8 years old, I started getting this book out of the library, How to Make Your Own Animated Films by Yvonne Anderson. And it shows kids making all different sorts of films. It's a great book. I think I have a copy that I got online. It was made in the 70s, but I didn't have a camera, I didn't have anything, and I kind of forgot about it until I was in college, and I started meeting all these people who are doing video art, which was very experimental. Um, and that's was kind of my segue. Because I always wanted to animate, and then I started meeting video artists, and it was kind of like I should go ahead and start trying it. But I'm kind of curious where other people kind of entered in.
Yeah, I could go in on that one. Well, first off, I believe for me it's a bit earlier because I grew up within the '90s, so I was experiencing experimental film. I didn't know it was experimental film. I just wanted something weird, and like I said earlier, it's like going to the thrift store, going to like the video store, walking back. It was always this kind of, it was very open then. And I also like at that time too, just getting into punk, also having this like cassette noise label. Those were my means of expressing myself. Also because I couldn't afford a camera. Yeah, I think my grandfather had a like a video camera, but I never liked what came out with it. And I certainly had friends make movies, but they were always kind of like a bunch of kids running around with like a very loose plot. And, sometimes you look back on those and they're really great in a certain way, and other times it's just like, oh, that didn't go so well. Uh, but it was such a big influence for me, and I think also, you know, growing up within the church too, on top of that, like you're in mass and you're surrounded by all these like people like holding their own severed head, like pierced and like basically in their all the in their post-death modes. That I was very much primed already for that, and it was a way for me to kind of like be, movies were a way for me to exit to the secular in a lot of ways. I still call myself like Catholic atheist, uh, because you can never get rid of it. Ah, YouTube, wonderful. And like within that kind of exit, uh, like you're just finding yourself because like we know when you're like ages 14 to, I'll even say like 20, like you just kind of like you want to do something and you just want it weird, and you might think you know the intellectual route, but you just spewing nonsense. But it makes you do strange things. Like when I was a kid, like at probably around the ages of 9 or 10, at midnight was all the kind of schlock horror like TV shows. There was also the Twilight Zone that was constantly on, which was a huge influence for me. And so I would kind of, you know, s- try to sneak out into the living room and watch those things on TV. And so finally, what I did one day is I went to the thrift store and I found this like dinky black and white TV with like the little rabbit ears and whatnot. And I think I don't know, I convinced my parents to give me $5 or something like that. Uh, and I brought it into my room, and then so I watched all these things in like black and white, and many of them already like that. And then on top of that, there were a lot of the Mexican horror films that were on. And I don't know, like growing up in California, you get that, especially if you're in Southern California or the Bay Area. I didn't know what they were saying, but they were pretty great. They were cheesy, which brings me to this one idea too. Is like I feel of all the genres, horror can be good even when it's a bad movie. I don't think there are any other genres where like it has a higher chance. I'm there's always going to be exceptions, but I think you could kind of get away with having a bad movie be great, or having something so over exaggerated, like the Ed Woods or something like that, or like a movie like Possession where it's just this constant screaming for 2 hours. I don't think you could get away with that in other films, and if you did do that, I think it would turn into a horror film. Uh, so I don't know. I think, and in that way, like youth and the expression of like the scream that we all have as we're growing up. Uh, I think in that way, like just horror is a natural, like uh, a natural expression for somebody going through, especially like puberty and stuff like that. You're like already becoming this monster. Like everything's happening weird. Guys are weird. Girls are starting to bleed. It's just like this whole kind of like, and other people are like beginning to go like, wait, what am I? Am I even those things? Like body dysmorphia is like happening. Like there's all these things starting to happen, and it's kind of the one area where you can relate to both the monster and the victim in that, and sometimes they're the same. Uh, so I mean, that's a very long way of saying that's kind of where like my youth and that change goes, and as I'm becoming going through my middle my middle life, my Dante walking through the forest uh, moment, I notice that the appeal has increased again because like my body's starting to do things, or I should say, my body's not doing things it used to do. I'm aware of things more. I'm aware of my knees more. I've never been this aware of my knees. Uh, so I don't know. My second puberty, perhaps. Uh, uh, and then one last thing is, I think also horror film is a way for us to, when we're first learning how to say and express things, I think it's our first way of like kind of being aware of the social unconscious that's around us, because it's like a hysteria, right? It doesn't know words, and we're kind of in that same moment too. So yeah, that's my long thing about youth.
I'm interested to actually hear uh, your uh, favorite selects too, Peter, especially given the kind of radical scale by which you were saying that you were looking at films, which I really uh, love too, because it gives you a sense of those elements of your practice, which are oftentimes using the archival in a way that there's like a destabilization that occurs to the illusion of it because of how you're manipulating the film, because of what obstructions or what eroding materials you're placing into the film, and also about how, or at least the way that I always view it in my own work as well, that direct manipulation, that direct process, um, either relieves a bit or reveals a bit of these elements of the horror. But especially given your feature film, I'd love to hear some of your points, and then uh, from that point to discuss maybe a bit more about this direct animation and how it relates.
Um, but I really love to follow the path of this nostalgic, going back to the past, and just watching our youth, and how is it happened when we first met, our first cinematic experience, which basically formed us. I was born in 1984, the Orwellian year. So it's just important you to understand that in the 90s, basically I started to watch films. In when the 90s started, I started to watch films, and when the 90s started, it was the collapse of communism, and it was a big change of Eastern Europe in a way of consuming culture and consuming pop culture. Because before the collapse of communism, there were Western movies and Hollywood movies, but there was a big gap between, the original presentation and the Hungarian presentation. For example, the 77 Star Wars movie was presented at Hungary like the early 80s. So there was a big gap between the original, and it was a gap, but it was just a half year. So when for example, I saw a trailer in the cinema, I had to wait for months to watch it. And it was a very interesting epoch in the 90s, because, for example, there was no commercial television at Hungary, just from 98. So there was only two or three television, which was basically state television, which was like BBC. uh, they screened a lot of art movie, for example. So it was very good for my brother, who recorded, Jarmusch and Agnes Varda and etc. But I didn't want to watch them. I did want to watch, American Ninja and the Steven Seagal movies and Rambo, etc. and etc. But I had to watch it. I had to watch them by from the German television and the Austrian television, which we can get at Budapest, and we recorded on VHS tapes, German dubbed Rambo and American Ninja and Steven Seagal action movies. So basically, I just started to understand what the fuck they are about, like when I was, I don't know, 20 something, because I started to learn English when I was 15. My first not Hungarian language is French. So I don't understand anything from Indiana Jones and, the war movies, but they were very important for me. For example, all the Spielberg movies I've seen uh, German dubbing, with German dubbing, and I didn't understand a fuck of them. So, or Hungarian dubbing. So the original sound was, it's very late experience for me. Um, and how does the horror connect to it? It's an interesting question, because I think for everybody, you have the first, you know real fear experience in cinema or at home with VHS, because sometimes it is at home alone with, watching shitty movies on VHS with your friend. And if you think back now for to the VHS tapes as an object, they can be scary, but just only to know, as a children, only to know that, they contain a horror movie, and only the, handwritten vignettes can be scary. For example, Alien is very scary. It was a very scary VHS experience for me. But cinema was always much more scarier, logically. And my first horror movie experience as a trauma was in 96, The Island of Dr. Moreau, with Marlon Brando and Val Kilmer, which was an absolute horrible trauma. I had to run out from the cinema. It was very deep trauma, and basically that's why I made 2 years ago a short experimental short film from the H. Wells novel. uh, Basically, I made my version of this novel, an experimental version, because I have to connect back to this childhood trauma. And I just started to realize after 30 something, when I reached the 30, I just started to realize that with my films, I always reach back to these childhood traumas unconsciously. Uh, and now I'm very conscious and I don't give a fuck, and I just want to go back to these first experiences. So for me, it was a very um, as a cultural phenomenon. The 90s at Hungary, it was very strange because it was the first free epoch of the country after, I don't know, 50 years. And it was strange because it was very strange to grow up in that 10 years. And I just start to realize that how strange was it, because it was before the internet. Basically, the internet boom. It was before everything digitized, but it was not purely analog. So it was somehow a halfway between big epochs. And I just started to I just started to be very interested in the 90s. So I will write a book on my 90s experience, and I just read some American books on the 90s experience, and it's very interesting how they connect and how they differ.
Before I say the next thing, I have to remind, because I haven't said this in a few episodes, but the opinions that I express on this podcast are those of my own and not those of Chicago filmmakers. So I have a series, a video art series that's a fake TV show that was aired out of order. And it's called Stuck in the 90s, starring the prom date fuck. And I play the prom date fuck. It is one of the things that I think is most core. It's also it's the comedic horror core of my absurdity. But the idea of this circling the well, it's also because there's something to being home alone in a basement, or in some sort of dark, closed space, with the only thing to keep you company being the buzz of a television or the buzz of some media. Having been born at the same time to 88, right? It's that particular period of time, and to really go back to Tracy's original inquiry, I think that that's part of the reason. It's your way of finding out how to express your vision. It was through the means that you were discussing, like of using animation techniques, for instance. While at that point, I would guess I was very lucky that there was a little video camera, like not even a digital 8 camera, and my grandfather had that, and we would play around with it for early age, and then over here at Chicago Filmmakers, they had a Super 8 camera, so that was where I was able to kind of, uh, as an intern, also be able to use film for the first time. The analog experience came from there. But when we're talking about like the experience, I actually just recently included this in a an exhibit in Los Angeles for Sarah Suarez. Sarah Suarez is amazing artist who we also had on the program a few weeks ago, doing some work on dreams. And so Sarah asked me, it was like one of the earliest dreams I had, as cinephile geeky as I was this idea that I was like looking for a particular film, and that film like was on a VHS tape. So some sort of experimental like horror film that was like impossible to find. It was almost like back in the day, Holy Mountain and El Topo were like, they were caught up in like legal issues, so you'd have to bootleg them. And I had the bootlegs of that. But it was something like more like Begotten, which was going for like $1,000. And there's something to this horror object idea, like the fact that it's like when you're talking about Tracy, you were talking about like no credits on the movie. It was like, yeah, either that or it has to look as though the credits themselves are like an artifact inside the movie. The movie itself has to almost be an artifact. And that's what kind of gives it a separation, because like the best horror work is almost, even though the creator could be behind every step of it, that there's like some sort of devilish thing that's behind the creator, you know, at every step of it. So there's this element to which like the analog helps to bring that out. Even just having it on a VHS tape helps to bring that out. But the digital is like in its oversaturation, and now in its so many, its patchwork of resolutions, its patchwork of frame rates, and its brokenness, etc. That's what I get from like both actually your animation too, to some degree, like the AI animation of the portraits, for instance, that you had, Tracy, in the Vast Lab program, but also in your work, of course. All of your works, but Michael, and when I think about the direct and the animated, then I find that the Venn diagram is more between Peter, and you, Tracy. So it's like there's interesting ways in which these dynamics of playing with energetic space, right, either directly applied or applied through an application manually, um, kind of translate to the tactile that the sensory perception of a horror object has. And so I kind of think of it as being like either horror works in two ways for me in my filmmaking practice. It's either one blunt thing, an event recorded, barely edited, blunt in that sense, or overworked, brutalized, deleted, extracted, re-layered, etc. Gone through a step of like almost like curing processes to get to the level of like that I needed. Anyway.
I wanted to speak to this idea, kind of brought up here and there, is like having the VHS as an alchemical object within that. I mean, when I was a kid, uh, we still did 16 millimeter kind of teaching things. So there was that whole process too of the teacher bringing this thing. But that was less able to, for an individual of any type, to grab that. But the VHS tape, uh, and bringing into the DVD, to everything, it is like, and I just never thought about this until now, of like this thing of what this could be when I put it in.
Yeah,
You know,
and sorry, and if you think the VHS tape is a box, it's a black box, basically a black box, which much more sinister. And I think that's why in the early 2000s there was a wave of horror movies like The Ring, and the Japanese version of it, but others which started to use the VHS as a sinister, some the place of the ghosts, etc.
Even
And
Lost Highway, I have to throw
yeah,
that one.
even Lost Highway, and it's another interesting thing that was the era when the VHS started to die. So when the VHS started to die in the pop culture, the filmmakers started to use as a ghost um, container.
Oh, I love that. That's so good.
So there is something very gothic in the VHS tape, and as a children, you feel that gothic aura in the tape. And yes, the film, the film reel, the 16 millimeter, the 35 millimeter, even the Super 8 millimeter for me is somehow is archaic and much bigger, like a dinosaurus. It's much more friendly, even if it's very big and you have to. If you have a reel of 35 millimeter film, it's, I don't know, 800 meter films, and it's big, and basically you have to digest it. but it's friendly because you see it, you can touch it, you can see the fucking images. Sorry for the fucking. But with the VHS tape, it's abstract, and it's somehow it's like a coffin. It's a small coffin of some ghost baby, or I don't know what. And it's very, for a children it can be very or for me it can be very scary. And if not just scary, but the source of the excitement, because for example, when I was an avid video store visitor, as I think everybody here, and to go into the video store to rent something for the night with your father, it was it was a process of it's like, it's not fucking browsing Netflix. It's going to a temple and to select and to watch the backbones of the VHS tapes and to read it. And so it's not just the nostalgic old man who is talking from me, or by me. It is, I think, it is absolutely objectively a fact that the VHS tape is an object which has some kind of aura, and if you were a child in or a teenager in that era, or a VHS era, this aura, I think, affected you as some kind of some kind of, I don't know, ghost.
Absolutely, 100%, it absolutely bears also that VHS was by far at the time, especially the most widely popular form of at-home entertainment for any of these movies to be recirculated, and for any of this quote film culture to prop up to begin with. I mean, yes, there are Super 8. I even have these like Super 8 reels of like the Ten Commandments and stuff like that, and 16 millimeter is a much harder prospect for like a working class family to have. But once my grandparents got a hold of the VHS, like they got all the things, and they some of the first VHS published that they were like these like 80s boxes and everything, like I Love Lucy. And for my grandmother, my grandmother and grandfather from Costa Rica and Ecuador. I promise this connects. So my grandfather would come home. He would like, my grandmother's name Lucy or Ana Lucia. He would be like, "Hey, Lucy." So it's like, that was his thing. So he's like got all the VHS tapes, and that was like kind of the way that TV and film culture was introduced in my family. It was a luxury item. Stories were really important to get funneled into the home. Around 5 o'clock, it was Primer Impacto and Univision, and then it was telenovelas after that. And then after that, potentially on a Saturday night, I was able to put in what I had. I had an old VHS of Jaws 3 for no good reason. Ridiculous movie. I had VHS tape of Howie Mandel's Walk Like a Man, which, oh my God. But then, like, in the midst of all of that, yeah, there were some things that got circulated, and The Fly at some point is one movie that I saw, and the trauma of The Fly was, I don't even remember watching it when I was a kid. I just remember the scene where they're doing arm wrestling, and it squeezes his hand out like cheese, like a liquid cheese, and breaks his forearm. And that image was so bad that I was talking about this to a college where I was like, I feel like I've seen this on TV, and I was explaining the scene, and he got the movie out and showed it to me, and the recirculating back to that point was of absurdity. It was like strangely feeling like I had been put into a Walt Disney like theme park ride, and I was being brought back into this point in time. Um, so I think that does have a way of circling. I would say though, my biggest moment, um, it was Mulholland Drive, because for when I was 13, 14 years old, having watched Mulholland Drive, and it was like 10 o'clock. I was over caffeinated. I watched that movie like 60 times, and it broke everything in my brain because it was the narrative aspects that I recognized I no longer had to claim as being essential to cinematic or any form of reality. And then I began to question all reality, and it just brought me down that path. Okay, because we are almost running out of time, and because it's been brought up, and I think it's somewhat tangentially related to this. Uh, let's talk about AI, if you don't mind. I want to put the floor out to discuss it a bit more, just because I haven't had a good conversation about AI. So I guess my question is, um, yes, I see like AI being used in multiple ways, and I see obviously knowing your work too, I've seen it creatively used, and I see like Clinton's, for instance, next week coming on Dan Brown, Jeff Zarilla in Argentina, all doing really amazing work with it. And I wonder though, like, where are the edges of this new exploration of aesthetics? Um, why is it that for some reason, no matter what I start to see out of some AI filmmakers, it all feels like it's part of the same thing? And is that maybe the same criticism that you were talking about before?
Well, I mean, would you say you see that in my work? I mean, not to put you on the spot, but I'm kind of like I think there is you know I'm really adamant that I have to use my own drawings in my own work. And when I first started seeing people, like I'm part of this group where we meet and we chat about our work, and there was this one artist who talked about how much he loved Midjourney because he could type this text where he talked about his favorite illustrator, and then he could kind of conjure up these images of things his favorite illustrator would maybe not actually make. And it almost seems like a parlor game to me. But it doesn't necessarily feel like, for me personally, that it would ever be my work. And then people put all these rules on it, and they say, like, I watched a panel last weekend where someone was talking about how they tell their artists they can use it up to a certain point in the process, but they can't use it in the final product. And I kind of flip that. So I'm kind of like, what? And I think I have to be inputting my work. And I like this idea of collaborating with a machine. And just like I might collaborate with you. So I like kind of seeing what it gives me and then going back in the process. But the idea of telling myself, well, I can use it in the beginning, and then all the underpinnings and all the foundation are the AI. And so I don't even know what to do with that.
Yeah, I think that what I'm getting at is that, and no, I don't see it in your work, because I think that the input matters very much to what you get in AI. Um, my my ethical considerations of it don't really extend to its aesthetics, because I find that everybody uses aesthetics in their own way, whatever. But it should always sort of form through a practice or a process. And I'm not necessarily saying that has to be all figured out, but that typically there's like in expression, there's a conduit that forms through you, and then you find the time where that tool is necessary for you and go forward. Of course, there's always going to be con artists as artists within all practices. I think a lot of it has to do with how much you bring in terms of thought consciousness to your work in general before you go into the practice of it. Because honestly, I think that there are some folks who could literally just use their body now as artistic performance practitioners, or even of just interdisciplinary practitioners. They can make the most out of that, and they could also use anything in their resources at their disposal. The thing that I start to become scared of, twofold. One is the idea of empty aesthetics is already, I mean, obviously that's kind of a mode of the entire 20th century, and it's quite, you know, I guess the thing that you could level at Hollywood. I wouldn't say 90s Hollywood, because I still think that there's some weird absurdity going on in those levels of spectacle, but maybe current spectacle Hollywood is this flattening that's occurred, but also the idea that maybe it could just be made by AI. And I think that may actually speak more to how dead is the consciousness of rather humanity due to all of our machinations we already have. Maybe AI is just a response to the fact that we've already made ourselves AI through all of these different means of false communication, of communication of nothingness, of communication of empty space. I'm afraid that algorithmically, this thing is going to ingest all of humanity and all of our very absurd and abject elements and spit it up right back to us in a way that leads us astray. But I'm not necessarily thinking of it as in the way of it as an artistic tool. I, though, am very interested for those using it as an artistic tool, what they think of it ethically in those other considerations.
As someone who uses it a lot, like I'm actually right now trying to redo the movie Haxon with AI, and like just trying, because it's about the prompt, so it's very much like writing a script in a lot of way. But and another thing I've done recently is like I've taken like images I've made with Midjourney and Dolly, and I've been getting them printed to 35 millimeter slides and then showing them back that way, so that it's kind of like it's the way we see it that changes. And I lean toward this idea. It really is like all the other materials we worked with have been just like that. We're just so grown up in them that we don't see the limitation that the style puts on us. And then perhaps, I don't know, maybe Tracy, you can like talk to this as well, is like as a tool, uh, and also as an art, I've come to situations where like I had some studio visits and I was using my AI images to like for inspiration for these installations I was making. So I had them running around in the background with like the curator visiting, stuff like that. And I immediately just went to the images and said, okay, that's the piece. And I was like, but that's just the AI image. Like I couldn't allow myself to let that be the piece. Like, and it was a really good lesson. It's kind of like that German artist who turned in a photograph to a contest and he won. And then
Right.
he denied the image because he denied the thing because like he said no, it was AI. But the thing was is he came away with the wrong lesson. All I learned from him is that he's good at making images. Like I didn't learn that his problem was like it was AI. It was like he won because he made a good image. So I don't know, like Tracy, if you've dealt with this thing about like whenever there's something that seems you can't like or at least for me, like I can't, my ego can't let go of the idea that the AI image is done, but it is done, and I have to like accept that perhaps like I'm just also suffering from the thinking of my time. And there's a lot of problems with AI that's more about labor, I think. But as far as this goes, I'm wondering, Tracy, if you like ever have the same experiences
Well,
with that.
and I think that's why I got that question about how do you know when it's done? Because if I'm allowing the AI to be the final product, where is my level of control of the image and the motion of the image and so on? And I mean, I have gone back and like using blind faith created like another 100 drawings and input those in response to what the AI gave me. Um, I'm not sure that's for everybody, but also I think on a side note, depending on what the AI is training on, you know, like Midjourney, or I'm not as familiar with those. I use Playform. It's a subscription service, and I forget who created it. I wish I knew, but um, you know, it's something where it allows me to train my own images. But I always worry, not worry, but I think if we're training on the popular images of the internet, well, of course, that's why paintings often look like Thomas Kincaid color palettes or something like that. So I think, you know, are we really training on, you know, white male popular images, and how is that? And so I'm more concerned about that. You know what I mean? Like, ick, how do I get rid of that? No offense to anyone else. It's just kind of like, for me, it needs to come from me. And so I have a hard time creating something that would feel so foreign to me. So I don't know if you are responding to that. Like, it still doesn't feel like it came from me because it's lacking me somewhere in the process. Or, I mean, is that part of it? That
Yeah,
separate?
I think so. I also, but it's also interesting that like I have a friend who does a lot of it, and her work, like when it's out there, I'm like, oh, that looks like her paintings, you know, and because I used to be a painter too, and when my images come out, it's like, oh, that looks like my paintings, you know, like so it's not necessarily like some like this professor I was talking to him, he was talking about chat gpt, and he was more like, why did we teach ourselves to talk like chat gpt? Yeah, like so it's like this reverse, like I mean, as far as like biases, that's like a very very like big problem that needs to be addressed. So when you do that stuff, you have to like really, when expressing yourself with prompts and stuff like that, you have to really like push beyond the bias, and your limitations will be smaller. But it means you have to be super aware of that, which is not any different than in real life, where we have to be super aware of our biases. The issue is the speed at which those biases come back at us, not necessarily that they are in it. So, like, I mean, that's kind of my philosophy about it. I'm sure my AI work will kind of just slowly kind of absorb into the other things, and then I flirt with all media, so I'll probably just absorb it and then move on to another thing. But like, I guess like my main thing is like that like that I felt when they said that it was done, I felt like I was like morally violated by that thing.
Right,
Like I was like, but no,
right.
you know. But I decided to accept it. I decided to accept the violation. Uh, I don't know. Maybe that's the Catholic back into
Right.
it. But like, I was just wondering what yours were. I mean, I think also you're doing it in a very different. I don't know if you're doing text prompt stuff. It doesn't sound like
I'm
it.
not doing text
So
prompts at all. I'm interested in
yeah.
text prompts to extend the drawings that I'm already doing. The thing that keeps me out of Midjourney is everything's public, right? I mean, other people kind of have access to it, or do they?
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
They do, but you can delete your chain as you go down, and like if you're like if it's about that kind of more, like I don't know, I've heard somebody describe AI art as
as what?
folk art, and like or
I'm
outsider
not-
art,
Okay.
you know, where it's like, you know, because like when people do it, they do like weird, silly things,
Yeah.
you know.
So I was doing this series of drawings with procedural drawing tools. I feel very much like charcoal. You can't really go back. I mean, because if you go back in with white, it all gets blurry and kind of gets messed up. So it was very direct, very direct drawing, like one shot, kind of like using charcoal. And so I did this series of drawings of kids' legs, feet playing bicycle, which is like this vivid memory of mine is playing bicycle as a kid and going back as an adult thinking, what was that about? What were we doing? And was it a power play? Was it, was it physical? Was there intimacy? What was that? Anyway, so I did these drawings and then I decided the first thing I did in Mid Journey was children playing bicycle, or legs where you see the legs and feet. And my God, it was a mess. It was awful. It was like this. It was like this. I mean, talk about horror. It was like this deformed shape with like bicycle and children kind of enmeshed. And it didn't look like anything that I would have ever made.
It's the liquid mechanomorphic virtual tumble from the nightmare realm, and that's kind of what everything is, though. I mean, for me, and I'm not saying that what you're using it for, the prompts that you're using it for, but rather the aesthetic of it, the medium itself, the way that it feels, is of like almost like the feedback, the loop. I've always seen like a whole bunch of folks use it for the fractal patterning of it, like the continually expanding down into a tunnel of an image whole, right? And of course, there's something intrinsically like uh, uh, amazing about that experience. But I also think it's partially because like I started making movies because of Wonkatania from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and just like the idea of being sent through a nightmare hole, that it itself was like a moment of like trauma. I want to unfortunately we have to end this episode of like Clockwork very soon, but I wanted to end with a question for Peter, because this is an interesting thing. I was thinking about AI generation and its maybe similarities, maybe and maybe it's actually something you'd think it's not at all similar with, but found footage. As a hip hop sampler and also a found footage filmmaker myself, and somebody who also uses a lot of found footage items as a almost like a canvas for an additional layering or additional erosion. Um, I'm wondering if you see the AI tangentially related to, or the plundering of AI to this searching for the found footage that is a big part of your practice. And when you're done with your comment, I'm going to have you say bye, and then I.
Um, Unfortunately, I'm not the good guy in the AI conversation because I am the AI skeptical. Not skeptical, I absolutely uninterested in the stuff. I do not have any feelings, just a little, you know, yeah, a little bit angry because as a teacher, I have to be Harrison Ford in Blade Runner, and I have to with every essay, I have to use my own Voigtkampf testing machine to see if it is AI or not, and it's very, very annoying. But it's not part of the art question, it's part of the everyday teaching practice question. It's annoying, and but the art question, or the artistic part of AI, i I'm not reached the point to be interested in AI, because I see AI as a tool, a little bit similar to Windows Paint, but much more sophisticated. But it's the same as Windows Paint, and we are in the 19th century, and somehow from the future, the Windows Paint has arrived, just skipped 100 years. And every impressionist painter is very amused that, Windows Paint, you can see what we can do with Windows Paint, but it's still Windows Paint for me. On the other hand, just give some and my English started to melting away as reaching the 2 o'clock in the morning. But as the AI is a tool, you give some what you give sentences to give AI back you something, and it's I feel like ask my neighbor to make a film or to write a poem. And the fun part, writing a poem is to write the actual poem. And I do not see now how can be fun not writing or not painting or not making the film. And I see how can it be, as for example Michael said, AI generated image can use as a layer and put back for example on film, etc. So I see it can be used as a layer, or it can, or as Tracy said, it can be used as a step in a process, as a step, as in artistic process. But I do not reach the point to be interested or to have any idea with this. So I am the pessimistic ending in the question of AI.
Not a pessimistic ending at all, because if anything, we all need to hear every single perspective, especially upon AI as a tool, and especially because it's going to eat our young eventually. So, with that being said, well, could you do me the honors though of saying bye and thank you for being there at 2 a.m. and love you all.
Bye.
Bye.